Hi, this is our last video on gold and our last video on the gold standard, the worldwide gold standard, and the pros and cons. We're going to start with the benefits, and essentially the gold standard provided people what they needed for money. It made exchanges highly convenient. And for the business people, they could make well, for anyone, you can make very large transactions. You could conduct transactions all across the world, and you could enter into transactions that were very long term, tens of years. And all of these were easy to do because there was a high level of predictability. And this predictability also led to high levels of productivity. And in the book, The Bitcoin Standard, there's a couple chapters that go into this. I find them really enjoyable. But the author of the Bitcoin Standard goes so far to say that everything that we have in our lives today is a result of inventions that happened during this period more than 100 years ago. And these inventions stopped when the gold standard ended. And for this piece here, this is hard for me to put my finger on. I'm not 100% on the whole correlation causation piece, but it is a fact that in the high water period of the gold standard, that there was no war. There was no war. Most nations were on the gold standard, and there were no wars. And now into the disadvantages, and we'll start with fragility. And the idea of the gold standard being fragile is one that I don't think is talked about enough. And so starting from the top, when paper receipts started, there was this distance between a bank and a state. The relationship had some distance between the two of them. And there were situations where the bank was allowed to provide more receipts than they had gold in reserve. And this was known as the fractional reserve banking. And the bank took a risk when doing this, because if there was a panic for whatever reason, people would run to the bank, and the bank would not have enough gold to give individuals who were trying to redeem their receipt. And this would kill a bank's credibility, and this would kill the bank. This was a very large concern for banks. Although they continued to do fractional reserve banking despite that. And as the gold standard progressed, and we have more nations joining the gold standard, all of these nation states started seeking out gold. And then we had big gold rushes in this time frame also. The 49ers in California was a big rush, in Australia. And as these governments started accumulating more gold, it was pushing these two closer and closer together. And now we had governments and banks close together. There was the gold, the receipts backed by gold, the nation, the banks. All these topics were now overlapping, and a run on the bank was no longer just a bank's problem. So now that we had a nation's gold supply in the mix, if there was a run on the bank, now it's a nation's credibility, the government's credibility, that would be at stake. And this had much larger implications. And I think this is in contrast to just the term, the gold standard. So this term conveys the notion of just pure strength, very strong foundation. But I think the reality is there was a lot of well, I think a piece of the gold standard, you had a lot of governments, a lot of nation states assuming a lot of risk, fully realizing that there was a lot of concern on it, and they probably would have considered the system fragile. And then that leads us into centralization as well. And there were, I'm just going to cover one reason about centralization. This one kind of seems obvious, but moving gold back and forth between these banks was enormously expensive. Gold is heavy. You had to secure it. You had to insure it. There was a lot of cost with that. So all the banks were trending towards something that was called earmarking. And in this example, this is at a nation level. this is a true event, but this happened a few years after the gold standard ended. But I think this concept almost certainly happened on a smaller scale with smaller, more local banks during the gold standard. And what you'd have is several banks, instead of shipping and doing final settlement in gold with each other, they would just pick a equidistant bank, and they would all put their gold in that bank. So when these two banks wanted to do final settlement, instead of going across the world, they would have their ambassador or some representative walk into the bank, pick up a piece of gold, exchange it, and go put it in that pile, and that was called earmarking. And then now this takes us to the end of the gold standard, and really the main problem with the gold and the gold standard was, even though gold was hard and it would restrict fluctuations in supply and demand, it was still gold was still an unpredictable supply, and this would have impacts, second, third order effect impacts in the economy. And now that banks and governments were in a converge into a closer relationship, this unpredictable supply put these entities in highly uncomfortable positions and situations, and taking high amounts of risk to the nation's credibility. And then on top of that, these individuals, government was taking on a new role, and while society was becoming much more connected and really much more advanced. But all of these problems went away just over the course of a few days, because after this assassination, it was just a few weeks after this assassination, was the start of World War I. It was the end of the gold standard, and very fitting end to the gold standard, and symbolic to what was to happen for the next 100 years after it's died. The Bank of England confiscated all the gold in the country, to include individuals' gold, in order to use that gold to pay for the upcoming war.